Hey there, welcome to Vision, the show all about the College of Arts and Sciences, and we have a great show for you today. We're starting things off with Dr. Stephen Brain. He is an associate professor and graduate coordinator in the Department of History. So welcome to the show. Thanks for coming on this Friday.
Thanks for having me.
Your areas of interest and research, we're kind of going to start off on basics, right?
Sure.
Russian, environmental,
Right.
and forest history. How are those linked? And maybe what are some take-home points for our viewers about that research?
Sure. Well, you know, of course, every country has its own environmental history. So, and there are people studying Canadian and all kinds of environmental history. So, the linkage between the two is the same for any other country. But what makes the combination of Russian and environmental history so interesting is because the Russian history is so different from that of Western Europe and the United States. I think that Russia has a reputation, and not completely undeserved, for being a polluted and dirty place, and that's not completely false. But Russian environmental history is interesting in the sense that when you study it, you realize in which ways and how early they were worried about environmental issues that maybe didn't come up in the West for another 100 years. They were trying to settle parts of their land that was prone to drought. They were thinking about climate change in the 1850s.
Really?
And they were thinking about deforestation and about nature preservation, even before the United States, which is often thought of as the leader. So if you study it, you see a lot of things you wouldn't expect because of the impressions that we have about what Russia is like.
And so let's rewind time a little bit.
Sure.
2013-14 academic year, you had a fellowship grant and had the opportunity to go over to Russia with your family.
That's right.
And live there for
That's
a
right.
year. Can you talk to us about that experience and what you brought back?
Absolutely. Well, you know, I've been 12 or 13 times now.
Oh.
So in terms of souvenirs, we didn't bring back all that much. But it was a really interesting trip because it was different than any other trip I've ever taken before. Normally historians, when they do the research abroad, lead very one-dimensional lives. Every day is expensive, every day is numbered. You try to get into the places where the archives and the libraries are and just work as much as you can, because if you don't finish your work, you have to come back, and that's not great. But this is different because the Fulbright program wants its grantees to be envoys. They want them to go and interact with the culture and not just spend all their time in the library or the archive. And so my family was there. They went to school. My son went to preschool there and spent the year in preschool.
And you have 2 children?
Yeah.
Okay.
My son was 4 at the time and he went to preschool, and my daughter was 7 at the time, and she went to 2nd grade in a Russian school. And then I also taught in a Russian university, which I'd never done before. So unlike previous trips where I just sort of ground away at the research, here I was out in the world doing things I'd never done before, and I saw an entire different side of the culture because I was at the schools every day, and it was really interesting like that.
And your family was there, but that was definitely an interesting time for your children.
Yeah, well, it was great, and I think they grew through the process. They know that the world is bigger than it had been for them, but also they are able to inhabit it too. I could see that changing. But at the beginning of the year, my daughter was at school and having a hard time fitting in. By the end of the year, she spoke Russian, and she was one of the crew, and I'm still proud of her for working so hard, but I think anybody can do it if they just go over there and decide to broaden their horizons.
Interesting. Very good. Okay, so fast forward some time. This year, you recently were named the Humanities Teacher of the Year. So can you tell us about that and what it means to you?
Sure. Well, it's an honor, of course, and it's gratifying to be recognized. I think that when I think about the other people in my department, I think that everyone, even though this is a research-based department at a research university, I think we all place a great deal of emphasis upon trying to bring our research to the classroom. And so I was glad to be recognized because I do put an effort in. I think that it's probably true for the entire faculty of the history department. It's important to bring what we're teaching, what we're learning to the classroom. And so it's nice to be recognized, and I hope that other people in the department will be recognized too, because it's important to all of us.
Yeah, and humanities and education, can you speak on that?
Sure. Well, it's a timely question right now because the university, and I think the country as a whole, is really emphasizing STEM these days: science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. And I don't have any particular problem with that, but I think maybe it's going a little too far to some degree. I mean, I was on a recruiting trip in Kentucky earlier this year, and the lieutenant governor visited the university that I was visiting and said that people shouldn't study things like, should avoid useless topics like history, which is the people who were historians in the audience were not a little bit offended. And I think for good reason, because STEM teaches people how to do things, but the humanities focus upon the human element and whether we should do things or what will happen if we do things. And so I think that one without the other is a problem. And so I'm glad to see the university is emphasizing the humanities, and it's a difference between training people and educating them. And I hope that the university seems to understand that it's important. And it's
wonderful.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Okay, thank you so much for joining us today. Stick with us. We've got more coming up after this short break.
Flight. It's driven mankind's dreams for centuries. The ability to soar above the earth, to travel to faraway places, to connect distant points. Manned flights to the moon and space were once the stars for which we reached. Now, unmanned aircraft are the future. At Mississippi State University, our teams are developing unmatched unmanned aircraft systems for an array of critical applications. We're so good at it, the Federal Aviation Administration named MSU the Center of Excellence in the field, asking us to lead the team that's creating the operating regulations for unmanned aircraft systems worldwide. So we're writing the flight plan for an industry that is the future. Our work means better information, more opportunity, and limitless horizons. For you. The sky really is the only limit.
Welcome back to Vision. Second half of our show today, we've got another interesting guest in studio, Dr. Maggie Hagerman. She is an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
And so I'm not going to try to speak on your research too much. I want to ask you to talk about it and why you got interested in your field.
Absolutely. So social scientists have documented extensively the prevalence of racial inequality in America. We know that race shapes people's opportunities, people's outcomes, and people's lived experiences. But what we also know is that there are lots of explanations that people have for why that racial inequality exists. And those explanations are rooted in history and are really powerful because they often serve to mask or even justify the inequality. And so when I was in college, I took classes and I learned about this topic, and I became really interested in particularly the role that young people and children play in learning about these ideologies, and then also how they either reproduce them or rework them, or also even perhaps challenge them. So yeah, that's how I became interested in my research.
Your current project is a book specifically looking at the angle of affluent white children and youth. What could our viewers maybe take home from that current research, kind of like the headline points that you found and learned?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that often is true is that parents think that it's all about what they say to their children that matters. So, for example, after the racial violence in the Charleston church shooting, there were a lot of headlines in the news about how to talk to your white kids. We need to talk to our white kids. And I think it's important to remember, and what my research really documents, that yes, of course, it's important to talk about race with children, but it's also important to recognize how kids learn about race from all of the different aspects of their life. And so my book is trying to really look at the comprehensive process, where kids live, where kids go to school, the media they consume, the travel that they participate in, their friendships, etc.
And so those are the different things where they absorb that information, not just from their parents.
Right,
okay.
and they interpret information from those spaces and then produce their own ideas. Again, either reproducing ideas that are really popular or maybe even reworking them in their own way.
Okay, and the Department of Sociology, you're a part of, is sponsoring Race in America lecture series here at Mississippi State this year.
Yes.
This year, so fall, spring. You've had guest speakers so far this semester, one more this semester, and then you've got more coming up in the spring. Can you speak on that series and maybe some of your involvement in that?
Absolutely. So we're so happy to be able to have this lecture series, and this is a collaborative effort. We're very grateful for the college and their support of this lecture series. And the objective is to bring people to campus from across the country and to talk about issues related to race and racism and inequality. And we've had some really great speakers already, and we hope to have more in the future. And it's just an opportunity for us to have an intellectual, empirically driven conversation about race at Mississippi State.
And here are some of those speakers here we see on the screen right now. What have been some of their topics so far this fall?
So our first speaker spoke about history, and our second speaker also spoke about history, and then our third speaker spoke about education and sort of how race plays out in the education world, and then our final speaker will be talking about race and actually the current political climate and the presidential election.
Okay, interesting. And this is open to the whole MSU community?
Correct, and even the community at large outside of the university.
Okay, and these lectures are free?
Yep, they're free, open to the public, and they've been very popular. We had, I think, 250 people at our last lecture, which is very exciting for us.
That is amazing. And what do you hope, I mean, I think you sort of touched on this a little bit, but what do you hope that the community here gets out of these, especially this next one, like you said, in such a interesting political year, right?
Right.
What is your hope? What do you expect that people here are getting out of this?
That's a great question, and I think that it's so easy to turn on television or look at Twitter or the news, and I think often the conversations that are happening there are important, but they may not be driven by empirical evidence and historical evidence. And I think it's really important for us to bring our research to the forefront so that people can, engage at a more intellectual level and look at what we know about patterns of inequality and patterns of race and the economy and all of these topics that are very controversial. And I always tell my students that having more information to make decisions is important, and so I think that it is quite relevant.
Okay, wonderful. So again, a couple more, or one more this semester, and then several more as we head into the spring semester. You can find that information out. I think I read that they're announcing it come sometime in November.
Correct.
Right? The future. Okay, thank you so much for joining us in studio today, and we'll have more coming up next time on Vision. So thanks for joining in. Have a good one.